As we approach the M48 bridge, we have to think back a little bit, because we actually left or locked down at about 6 o'clock, did the 6 miles to the Prince of Wales Bridge in just over 3/4 of an hour, came round the corner and did the next 3 miles, and now it's just turned 7:30, and we need to be in Tintern by about 9:20. I always think this is interesting but not interesting, because when you come in you don't realise, looking at this, that you're actually coming into the River Wye in the Wye Valley, and really all you're seeing is an estuary. All the way across this morning we had a problem with the wind, and now we just turned the corner about half a mile up from the bridge, and just on the right starboard side we're coming into the Chepstow Boat Club's new mooring, and they have a crane there as well, as you'll see in a second. There used to be, and they still have, the floating pontoon by the boat inn, just below the bridge in Chepstow, and that's a shot over the stern with Andy and myself having a little bit of something to eat before we get into the real interesting part of going up the Wye Valley.
On the way along, Paul was telling me when he was here, they'd unload ships from the
And just on the left, although you can't see it, we're going now past the what was the shipyard, and I read a report in about 1900, and the ships built in Chepstow were actually held out as what was going to be the new British standard for quality and construction. Today it's a brand new housing estate, and that's just on your left hand side if you were sat where we're sat now, coming up the river. Just to your left you can now see what was the quay for Larkin's Sand and Gravel, and ahead is the main road into Chepstow. And 5 years ago, looking to your left now, just centre of the bridge, none of the flats that are there now were there, and all you had was access to the bank all the way down, and of course all that's been closed off, so I don't quite know how they got the authority to do it when it was a towpath and had been a right of way for 1,000 years. It was a common law right to the banks of the Wye on both sides for the whole of the length of the Wye. When we came into the Wye, one of the calculations we had to work out was we needed about 10 metres of water on the M48 bridge, which would be sufficient water in the Wye to float the 2 pontoons in Chepstow. And through experience we know that when those pontoons are floating, which are just on your left there, it's disappeared, you've got enough water to go the rest of the way up the Wye, up as far as Tintern, without running out. And that's the back view, of course, of the A48 bridge. I don't know whether it was the weather or not, but must have been about 500 seagulls actually sat on the bridge when we went underneath, and got quite annoyed that we passed underneath. All on the right hand side now, when the tide is out, there are moorings. What there are is handmade chains. Some of them are probably a foot, each links are about a foot long, and the big rings that are a couple of foot, all handmade, where all the work that was waiting to go into the boatyard, which is just on your left there below the bridge, used to be moored. waiting for its attention of the yard itself. This is now the mooring in Chepstow, with a boat in just to your left with a floating pontoon from the boat club. And it's hard to imagine for 800, 900 years this was where all the goods came into Chepstow and used to drop an anchor there or dry on the bank on the left port side, just where I'm stood now. And you can see the bridge ahead. And at the moment we're doing nearly 9 miles an hour, and that's just with the tide and ticking over. And what's really nice is when you come under the bridge, what you see in the distance is Chepstow Castle. That gives you some idea of the speed that we're doing. And as you can see from the wake, we're hardly making anything at all because we're going with the current. We're sheltered from the wind now, and the engine's only ticking over. Actually, I think it was 8 or 9 miles an hour on the gauge. The castle itself functioned up until the Civil War, and then it was taken down and destroyed after the Civil War. But just on the left below the castle is almost a large eddy where the river goes round and round, and all the supplies for the castle were brought in by boat and offloaded just underneath it there onto a platform that had been there for hundreds of years. And just as we round this corner and you go into the Wye Valley proper, goodness me, it was about 6 years ago, we were moored there overnight. And just as the tide started to come in, we heard a bit of a splash. It's a moonlit night as well. And just on the left bank as you see it now, and what we'd actually seen was a seal. And I think he'd popped in and gone had his breakfast, and then you could see where he slid down the bank and came home when the tide was in, and because the tide was in and the river was 10, 15, 20 foot higher, all he did was lift himself out and go under those branches, and he got, I'm not sure what a seal's nest is called, but that's where he lived for a long time. And I believe there was a bounty on him by certain fishing people, salmon fishing people in the Wye Valley. So we sort of always go by and wave to him. Whether he's still there or not, I don't know, but of course that was 5 years ago. And there's a stern shot, back shot now of the castle to give you some idea of the size of it. And in fact, if you do have time, it's worth going and having a look around the castle, because all the cellars, dungeons and everything else are still intact. That wasn't knocked down. I think it was the end of the Civil War. They only took out of the place, same as Hereford Castle was taken down, anything of value. Now as we've actually completed the turn, the castle's behind us, stern, and you've got about a mile ahead of this strait. and about 20-25 foot of water underneath you. Now at this point, it's now about 7:45. The tide on the Old Severn Bridge, the M48, is set, and it's still rolling up the Wye Valley, so we've actually got to be in Tintern by about 9:20. Otherwise we'll run out if we're going up to Landogo. In fact, if you look at the stern shot and see the little bush on the bank standing up, and just to the right of that was where the seal made his home, and he used to come to the edge and slide down the bank at that point. And what you do see occasionally is a deer coming for a drink to down to the river, because we're going up quietly on the tide, and they don't realise you're there until you've passed them.
Where's the wood?
We've now passed over 2 of the weirs. As I said, there's 5 weirs in, and these were used for right up until the Wye border conservators in 1900 bought out all the salmon netting rights. And just around the corner where the seals flying by in the field is another weir that we pass over. And you always have to be a little careful, because these weirs are about 6 foot tall, and the tide rushes up to them, stops, fills up, and then off you go again, a bit like a jackhammer. It's bang, 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 off you go again, and then you get to the next level. And as you can see here, we're consulting our little ordnance map and looking for the next weir, to make sure we don't ground out on it on the way up. But I did mention earlier on that normally, if the Chepstow Club's pontoon is afloat, then you can go all the way up to Tintern, because at each stage you've waited long enough, it's built up, and over you go up to the next stage. And if we're in doubt, normally what I do is we've got a big pole in the front of the boat, and it's Andy's job to go forward and just check exactly how much water is under the boat and whether or not we're on top of the weir. I didn't like to tell him he got his map upside down. And what a lot of people don't realise, I think, is that you look at the Forest of Dean now, but 200 years ago, at the time of Nelson, with the iron foundry at Simmons Yacht and the demand for timber for the Navy, most of the oak trees and most of the trees had actually been felled, and Nelson is supposed to, and I believe he did, anchor Victory in the estuary, and then got his guys to row him up to Ross. And I think he paid a visit to Hereford as well, which is why there's a statue I think in both places and certainly in Hereford. And he organised, I'm led to believe, the replanting of the Forest of Dean. And this is really what you're looking at now, is 200 years on. And what I'm doing now is using my phone to check on the levels at Sharpness Docks. And we know at 9:20 there'd be 6 metres of tide at Sharpness Docks, and that 9:20, if we take it across to Tintern, we should have more than enough water to pass over Plum Weir, which is the last weir by the Abbey, with about 5 or 6 foot underneath the under the keel. And looking at it now, what we're doing, what the river is doing is, as I said, it goes in fits and starts, and the tide tries to get past somewhere. It can't get past somewhere. It has to build up the water below the wheel. The water on the top side backs up, and this bit appears to be absolutely dead flat. In actual fact, you're going up, even though there's thousands of tons of water being pushed into the Wye with the tide. The tide is still running at Sharpness. Until it gets over each weir and turn, it stays exactly flat like this, which years ago made it a very interesting navigation for commercial use. Boats could safely get in and out without actually doing 6, 7 or 8 knots loaded up. As soon as it reaches the top of the weir, off it goes again at 2 to 3 miles an hour up to the next weir. And what you found is there was generally a mooring or a landing or an offloading area almost by each weir as it went up. And what we're coming up to now is Wall Weir, and on your left there's a ginormous quarry which you can't see. I believe it's all fenced off now and used for, I'm not sure whether a film company has it, but the public don't have access to it. And we actually, about 5 years ago, were on top of the weir when we lost the water, and that's in one of our films. We put it in because we thought it was interesting and we should put it in. So anybody going up here in future would have a reference.
Where that tree is. That's the weir. Never seen that before.
And that's what we're passing now. But I'm also led to believe that there was, from one quarry, there was 2 quarries, one on one side and one on the other side, in which you can just see behind Andy's left shoulder as you're looking at him, the remains of the other one. Electricity cables, telephone cables all across here, and I'm not sure whether it was in the 50s or not when the quarry was being used. A lighter aircraft came around the corner and ran into it, and there was a serious accident there at this point here.
They're all right. They're all right. No, the wheel's not there yet. The wheel's there. No, we don't want to do the pole. We're fine over the wheel.
And you can see from the debris of the flotsam that the tide is trying to get over Wall Weir, and it can't, and this is why it's all hanging about at this point until it gets up perhaps another half metre, and then off it goes again. And once again, as you can see, the tide has been held back. We've slowed down to about 4.5, 5 miles an hour, and as soon as it's built up, off it'll go again, and the current and all the flotsam that you see now on the right starboard side shoots off up the river if you happen to be canoeing down or going down in a boat like this, it's difficult to choose a path because the whole of the river is covered in trees, debris of all sorts, which gets pushed to the top of the tidal limit, and then it comes back as the tide starts to retreat. And as the mornings wore on, and obviously the sun gets higher, gives you some idea of the Forest of Dean and the forest on the Tintern side, because the light, I suppose, it lightens, illuminates all the trees on either side, and this is what you've got. And a lot of people don't see this because there are no towpaths now down either side, so you don't actually have access to walk along the bank of the river here, at this point, the River Wye. So anybody in a boat, canoe, whatever, is in a very privileged position if they've got a camera to get pictures such as this. And as you can see, we're going a little bit faster, and that's because the tide has picked itself up, gone over the next weir, and also all the flotsam has cleared, all the debris, floating debris. And that's gone on to the next one, and it starts all over again until it gets to the end of the tidal limit. And this should be the start of the build-up. Or just under the bridge in Tintern that's just been restored, the Wye Works Bridge, and it builds up there and then shoots up round the corner to here we go. So we've actually just gone over Plum Weir, and once again you've got this mirror finish whilst the water is building up and not moving forward. And just on the left port side of the minute you should actually see the Abbey. And there's a Wye Works Bridge ahead that they've just spent, I think it's over £1 million renovating. That's a nice way of putting it. And all this land on the right hand side now belongs to our friend Jim Simpson, Jim and Mary Simpson. And it's a small holding called Ferry Farm. The interesting thing is that where their platform is to access the river was in actual fact the main road down to Tintern before they put the toll road in at Bigswear in about 1846 and built the road, so it was I suppose it's a bit like putting the motorways in at that time. Up until then most people used both sides of the river as a footway, way and towpath. And of course once the toll bridge had gone in at Bigswear, all that stopped, and the crossing of the river, as there was no bridge here at that time, was actually from on the right side here on the starboard side, where we'll just ease over a minute to say hello, into the Abbey. And I think this is where the monks took their taxes and everything else from anybody using the road. Of course that's 500, 600, 700 years ago. But what is nice is when the tide is out, you can actually see the large sandstone blocks that formed either side of the causeway across. So in actual fact it was authorised crossing that came down just past where our friends are stood now.
Hello. But what are you all doing here?
It's hard to imagine there's about 25 foot of water underneath you at the moment.
No, we're stopping in Landogo.
That's Caroline
Are you
Simpson
coming up?
and two kids, nice people. Just under where we are now,
What?
when it dries out, there are these
Yeah.
great chunks of sandstone with metal bars in them that form
tonight.
either side of it. And as you
Are-
can see, we're in an
Are
eddy
you
here. It's
camping
just
here now?
so it must have been quite interesting to take your cows or your herd of cows across to that point, or go across in a stagecoach when the tide was out.
He's in. Well, if you change your mind, we'll be in the pub tonight.
Now, the original plan was to go up to Landogo and stay overnight. We rethought it, and rather than staying up at Landogo, we decided to come back down, moor there for the night, which meant then we had a better chance of getting back to Portishead in good time to be lifted up. It's now 9:20. The tide is another 20 minutes, the tide will be gone. The tide is still coming in, it's held here at the moment, and we can actually see as we were looking at the bank on either side, you can see the water going by. So we got 3 miles to go, so what we're going to try and do is see whether we can actually achieve what we intended to do, and that's to get up to Llandogo, turn around and come back down and film it. And as you pass through the bridge, you can look at the bridge and you can still see that the water's moving on either side. So we still have the tide, and we also have about a 20-minute spot from the top of the tide before it actually turns and starts to come back down. On the right is where, when we bought the Wye Invader up in 1989, where we moored her for a couple of weeks before we moved on up the river and eventually went up to Hereford. What might be a surprise to most people is that this was quite a busy place 200 years ago, and all this on the left is the old quays where ships came in, small ships, 7 trows and some bigger ones, and moored all the way along here and were offloaded or they were waited to be offloaded, or some carton, whatever they bought in was then sent all over the Forest of Dean and that part of Gloucestershire and Monmouthshire. I mean, what's also hard to imagine is that by the tennis courts below the bridge in Hereford, 150-ton boats were built right up until the railways came in 1850. And quite often boats being brought down the river and then fitted out at the Chepstow boatyard would be moored up here waiting for a tide. In fact, we stayed above Brockwere for a couple of weeks and then continued on down to Chepstow. And this is what most people did. And we think, although we're not wrong, that the little house they're passing on your left now, we think it was the harbour master's or the person that was in control of what came in and out house 200 years ago. And certainly 2 or 3 times in the winter, when there's 2 or 3 metres of water in the river and there's a big spring tide, the road through Tintern has half a metre or a metre of water on it quite often. I suppose that's the reason for having, 500 yards of quay there. And what you don't see is up in the forest behind it. If you take the trouble to get in your car and drive up or pedal up or walk up or whatever, as you're going up each of the little valleys, what you'll see is a series of dams that were actually where the water provided the power for the workshops, for iron foundries and all sorts of industry on the right hand side up in that wooded area behind you, as in the Forest of Dean. There'd been a large supply of coal which was used to make this quite a prosperous area 200 years ago, before the railways came. And certainly going back as far as the Norman invasion, and a lot was controlled by Chepstow Castle, of iron, coal and various other things. We're doing probably 5.5, 6 miles an hour now, but you can see from the wake that we still got the tide. The next obstacle we've got is by Tintern railway station, which is just round the corner. And when the bridge was knocked down in 1966, a lot of the sandstone blocks were actually just dropped in the river and left there, which is just at the end of this strait here. And what you can't see is, if you were to look to your left now, as you're going through Tintern, they've got a vineyard, and they make their own wine. In fact, just over my elbow is, on the side of the hill there, is where the vineyard is. And there was a vineyard, I believe, there 500 or 600 years ago, before Henry VIII closed down the abbey. In fact, where the White House is between Andy and myself is where the vineyard is. Now we're almost on top of the tide now. We've got about another 20 minutes, and then 20 minutes after that before the water starts to roll back. So we need to get to Llandogo. If we don't get there, as the river starts to roll back, we'll stop and go about. But if we can get there, we'll get there. Although you can't see it at the minute, if you were walking along the foot towpath on the left hand side there, you between the river and to your left is Tintern railway station. And just as we turn the corner, we should see Weir in the distance. And in the woods behind you on your left hand side is what was the main road before the bridge was put in at Weir, running through the woods down to Ferry Farm and crossing by the Abbey, of course, where the monks took their slice of everything that went across the river. And there's the bridge at Weir. I think it's not last year or the year before, there was about £1 million spent on that, restoring it, and when we passed underneath it, I think whoever did it made quite a nice job of it. You can actually see the underside.
Very fun.
Now what is interesting is if, whether we're catching or not, the Gloucester Harbour trustees are the harbour authority up to Bigswear, and on your left you'll see a portside navigation marker. So we're still on the statutory navigation, it's still live, and this bit of it's administered by the Gloucester Harbour trustees. If you look immediately to your right is where, at 2014 there was a river festival and the whole of the Brockway Key was cleaned off. The locals don't want people to use it and have gone out of the way to make sure, and I think, there you go, there's the top of the quay. When the tide has gone down, there's 10 foot of stone all the way down, and that's been there hundreds of years. And it's almost unusable now because I'm not sure whether it's to do with the parish council or not. They will not allow anybody to wash off the top again, even though it's a tidal estuary, and this is a foreshore. And on the right, what you have is the new towpath, which was finished in 1809, and you can see it there, and that goes all the way to Hereford, and it was a horse towing path, 10 foot wide, and that then goes on all the way up the river to Hereford. There was a horse towing path on the right and on the left. There was a man towing path on the left and on the right, and this was the latest upgrade in 1809. But today, it's virtually disappeared. And even though there's a right of it by statute, with common law rights attached to it, almost every half mile you find a notice that says private bank, keep off. The other problem we've got here is various fishing obstructions in the river, so you have to be careful that you keep to the right side, because as the tide starts to go down, it's quite easy to ground on the various obstructions that are in there. And it's about 9:28. We've got about 20 minutes now before the tide actually starts to go back at the top of the tide. So we think we can probably just get to Landogo before we have to go back. I mean, this bit is absolutely gorgeous, and on the right is the boathouse. There's quite a large house just out there on the right hand side, so it's obviously the squire's house or something like that, some of importance. And there's 2 or 3 really nice houses here on either side, so something to do with the various estates that had occupied and administered this part of the river. But once again, it's hard to imagine there's a 10-foot towpath on the right hand side, which was built for horses, not for men towing their boats, which was a step up. And of course then the railways came and closed it all down. We're about a mile to go, and the tide has not yet turned. We're going reasonably steady just to look for the signs of the tide turning before we have to turn back, because where we are now there might be 4 or 5 foot of water underneath us, but no more. We're about 200 yards from the quay, 200 metres from the quay at Landogo, with about 4 foot of water underneath us. So, and the tide is just starting to turn. You can see the traces under the trees where the water's going back the other way. And that clump of trees, almost mid-screen, is the old quay at Llandogo. And on the right there's a sand bar. And that for right up until the 1860s, boats were bought up and actually scrapped or taken apart on the right-hand side, directly adjacent to the quay.
The other side of the trees and turn.
And as we get a little bit closer and you look under the trees, you can actually see all the stonework, the ancient stonework that's there, and that's been there for hundreds of years. And a tidal limit is about a mile ahead, which is at top of the Weir, just by the bridge. And that's where the foreshore officially ends. And this is the pool below, where the bigger boats would be moored there. But it's quite deep just there, even though it's quite shallow on the right-hand side, and you dry out fairly quick behind Andy, where the quay itself is. And if you look at the bank, I think you can just see that it's beginning to move in the centre of the screen, just where the bank and the river meet. In fact, you can see there just by the bush. If we'd had a bigger tide, we could have actually gone on up to Weir and did our brake turn there. And in fact, we did when we went to first boat to Monmouth. We went under the bridge, but I think this is absolutely beautiful, and very few people see it like this. And although the tide has started to go back, it's not yet obvious. We certainly couldn't hang about here. In 20 minutes time, we'd be sat on a pile of rocks where we are now, so we have to get a little bit of a move on. But then saying that, we're doing sort of 5 or 6 miles an hour now, just ticking over, and you can see that from the film. I think what you can see from this is that all the rain we've had this summer is reflected in how green this is now to what it was last year. It's almost jungle, isn't it? And the other thing that was interesting is that when you look at it, it's almost peaty in colour. There's the quay there. It's now covered up. And you can see now the speed that it's starting to unfold.
Yeah, look, it's gone down now. You can see the wetness on that stair. So it's dropped. It's gone down now.
And there's just a little bit of an incline there. When the water's out, there's a rapids there. If you're canoeing or something like that, you can do that bit. I think what happens is the tide gets as far as Tintern, and I think it backs the water up, because once you've got to Tintern, you don't seem to get the muddy, dirty water past the Wye Works bridge, and all you've got is this beautiful, almost peaty coloured water all the way up the river at that point. And I think that's all that's backing up. And once again, if you're looking at the right and you see the large white house, and just behind that is the vineyard. And I believe there's been one there for hundreds of years, going back to when the abbey was built. Just on your right starboard side there, you've got the church. There's also a little building that's the new sewer pump for the whole of that area. But there used to be a crossing here. And one of the local fellows uses it to pull logs out the river and runs his little business of, quite often you'll see 3 or 4 trees sat outside here in the winter. And it put a spike in them and then pull them in and turn them into firewood, which is just on the right side there at that point. I mean, I think you could be in Canada or in some parts of the States. People going from here to the Americas in the 16 and 1700s wouldn't have been out of place when they got over there on the east coast of America. When you look at this lot, I think it's you can see why they settled in so well. And the other thing I think is interesting, all this is supposed to be public wharfage, and almost all of it now has got a label on it saying private parking. And yet it's the foreshore, and nobody can claim the foreshore because it belongs to the Crown. And I don't understand where. And that shot there is a view is lovely, isn't it? It's absolutely. I mean, we're really quite privileged. We go up there, and it takes a little bit of thought to get there, but to enjoy this and no other boats on it. And the Chepstow Boat Club are really quite privileged where they are. If they go upstream, they come into this, and if they go downstream, they're out into the Severn. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but it was said in the 1850s there was a couple of dozen pubs at least in Tintern, so it gives you some idea of how big the place was. With the wire works and all the iron smelting and everything else that went on in the woods behind it, it was quite a hive of industry. I don't think half the people that visit realise what it was. And if you look behind us now on the bank, you can actually see we've lost at least a metre of water as the tide's now well on its way out. And you see it again there, you can see the tide mark on the bank. interestingly, they put some of the rubbing strips on, and there's metal bars sticking out from them by about a foot. That much. Yeah, well, they just put them in. So heaven help anybody who goes down there and gets too close. We've got a small problem now of going about. Without sinking Jim's boat. It did turn out to be the right move, because when we got back on Friday morning, we had about 20 minutes, half an hour to spare before we lost the tide. So rather than staying overnight in Landogo, I think it was the right move to come down to Tintern, stay overnight, and then leave an hour or so early against the tide to get back. Ready for the return up to Sharpness on Saturday morning, early AM. And so before 1846, if you'd have been stood there now with the river, no tide, you would have seen lots of people, stagecoaches, herds of cattle, all being driven across that crossing when the tide was out. As on a properly maintained, I suppose it's a causeway, isn't it? And you can actually, once you're outside Ferry Farm, you can the walkway or the roadway, as it was then, is still there to walk through up to Brockwere today. Okay.